to order at 7:04.
All right, first order is public comments. Public for comments, all right. Board member comment? Start that side. It's all good, all right, and we'll move on to our discussion, possible action, item A, search process for the assistant superintendent for pupil personnel and budget. So just opening comments, just as a reminder, recap, when we last met as a joint board, we decided on structure of defining this role, and then also budget placeholders in everybody's budgets for this person, this role being in central office. And then we, Region 9 asked if we could meet with Ms. Alconte, which we did, so we appreciate having the time with her. And I think we're at the point now where it's open discussion on how we want to proceed around either appointing or search process, so we can make decisions between our boards for our budget on how we're going to fund this role and move forward with the role. That's the point for the conversation, and then
I think without burying the lead, I think the ball is sort of in Region 9's court.
So in order to discuss, you want to put a motion on the floor?
Sure. I think we can do that.
Okay.
Discussion?
So I'll move that the Region 9 Board continue to support the proposal from administration to add an assistant superintendent for pupil services to the central office staff, and further move to direct the administration to notify stakeholder groups to begin drafting a formal job description document, hold focus group meetings to create community awareness, and to conduct an employment search in alignment with best practices in previous searches of the board.
Motion and seconded here. We'll discuss amongst ourselves, but if anybody else wants to have.
Anybody on Reading want to make the same motion? No.
Anyone at Easton want to make the same motion? No.
Let's discuss on our board.
Certainly fine. I think, you kind of accurately described that the Region 9 Board did discuss this, and it seemed like the board felt that a search and, a traditional approach to adding a central office position in alignment with how we've done it in the past was the
overwhelming consensus?
Yeah, overwhelming, or the, the approach we felt most comfortable with. So I think that's kind of where my position is at this point. I don't know everyone else.
I'll add to that. I agree with that to some extent. I do agree that the majority felt that there should have been a more formalized process. But my personal view was I needed more clarity around what formal process was required by law, what we have done by practice, and whether or not there's any change between or differences in either, or differences in hiring higher level employees of all five schools, whether or not there's a difference in process for internal candidates versus external candidates. And I did ask that question to the administration, and I did receive answers that while I initially had concerns with the process, or perhaps it was not just that I was not aware, or perhaps the Region 9 Board was not aware of the process, I certainly was not. And I would like to discuss, or just kind of air out for really more for the public's information, what that process is and how we've consistently applied it across all 5 schools over our history. So I'd like to spend some time just to recap that so everyone is on the same page.
Okay.
And I don't know if I could, Tom, if
I
you
don't know who wants to speak.
if you want to speak to that, or I could just read what has been provided.
Well, there is no statute laid out on how you hire your senior executives. Your practice, for the most part, has been that the superintendent, central office staff develops the job posting with input from various people, including board members, that The job is posted, and then a document review of applications is conducted by members of the central office staff. Then we progress to telephone interviews with a number of candidates in the searches that I've done, 8 to 12 or so people. At some point, we bring in candidates to be interviewed by the assistant superintendent and me. Sometimes the director of the human resource manager joins in, and others as we see appropriate. We get it down to 3 or 4 people, and then put together a stakeholder interview panel, including parents and teachers, administrators, other relevant folks, board members, and they interview generally 2 or 3 candidates. They deliberate, make a recommendation. I have made it clear in each of those stakeholder interviews that ultimately I make the decision. It's advisory, not that that group makes the decision. And we've generally followed that practice. I believe that when Dr. Pearson-Ugal was appointed, it was at the request of Dr. Josephsberg, and a search was not conducted beyond her appointment from principal at RES to assistant superintendent. But in general, the process would be to be deliberative and include many people. The central office positions are in contractual arrangements with all 3 boards, divided into thirds, so it is different from hiring, say, a teacher or support staff member.
All right, and so, and again, but creation of a new position is a little different than filling an existing position. I think historically that's been handled differently, and I don't think when we created the curriculum director position that we said to the superintendent, hire, you know, your curriculum director and let us know who you want. And I think it was more of a defined process in the beginning. And I think the same is true when we created the finance director position way before I was on the board. It was, you know, it's not just a expanding personnel at central office. This is a, you know, a major position, you know, at central office, and so there has been a defined process that's been used historically.
Yeah, as I said when in proposing this as a possibility, this is a unique situation in which if we were going to advance in it, I didn't want the current director to have to go through a search process and become a candidate for the position if that meant she could potentially not be hired in it. And so my personal preference would be if the Region 9 board didn't see its way to making the appointment, that we simply revert to the current status, which is you have a director of special education for Easton and Reading, and you would hire a separate director for Region 9, which is the current arrangement.
I'd be interested in the Reading and Easton board members' views on how does it compare and contrast with Reading's appointment of or search for the principal for the middle school, and also just I know the last time we all met, both boards felt very strongly about the qualifications and that the Ms. Del Conte is doing an excellent job. So I'd like if you're willing to share the color around why you're comfortable with that, with respect to past practice of the search process, or in some cases we do a formalized search, some cases we don't. How did you reconcile and get comfortable with that, and particularly compared to the JMS principal?
Well, because we went through the process.
Sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
point of order,
Go ahead,
there's
the
nothing
move.
clear. You haven't,
There's no motion.
Oh,
there's a
sorry.
motion on Region 9 for discussion.
Okay.
I'll make the motion to, just for the sake of participating in the discussion. Anybody second?
Make Mike's motion, Chris seconds, so now it's on the floor for us to answer Cheryl's question.
I make the same motion.
Okay, and a second? Okay, we're in the room, so.
Okay, now we can do
As an individual board member, I was comfortable with it because we went through that process that Dr. McMorrin just described there to find her. put together, the job offering, put it out there, phone interviews, narrowed it down, stakeholders from the schools. So stakeholders from 4 out of 5 schools and from 2 out of 3 boards participated, and from 2 out of 2 towns. And I realized that you weren't there, that's probably the hang-up, but
But the Region 9 director was there.
that's right. But that's right. That's right.
Patty was-
So there were a lot of people there and made that choice. That's why we're comfortable. And, I've been working with her since the beginning of the school year, and feel comfortable going forward.
And I think our view was also colored by the fact that we felt like we've been wandering in the wild of special ed for the past 3-5 years with a series of interim directors where it's one step forward, one step back, one step forward, one step back, and having a sense of permanency is a considerable comfort that I don't think we would find if we went out to start the whole process all over again.
And similarly, while it's a small sample size, the data that she's generating and showing us in terms of PPPTs being down, exits being up, it's all following form with what we were looking for when we put this together.
That's true.
Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
First of all, hi, everybody.
Welcome back.
Yeah, welcome back, Chris.
You all look different. I just wanted to comment on my recollection, which goes back a few years, of specifically central office, how top central office positions have been filled. And I think it's fair to say, Mike, you referenced the director of curriculum, who I believe was Marie, back in the Fossbender days. That predates even me, so I don't remember that process. The only two that I do remember are the current assistant superintendent and the current director of finance and operations. And I think the way it was described is correct, which tells me that there is no well-defined process. In other words, I would not agree with the portion of the motion that suggests that there is a well-defined process, because I don't think there is a well-defined process. Those two positions were filled differently, perhaps imperfectly, perhaps people didn't like the way that it was done, which I know was true in one case. And that may all be true, but, and I would be delighted if you could get all 3 boards to agree going forward on what the correct process would be. I doubt if we could do that tonight. That would be an effort. So, that's the only context that I can give you, Cheryl, from, going back to 2008, I guess, is that, arguably we have been remiss in not nailing all of this down, but I don't see anything, and I'm speaking sort of as objectively in my own experience as I can. I see nothing in the way this was done that is violates some process or precedent, because I don't think there is a process or precedent.
The other thing that I would add is that when Marie Moss was the director of curriculum, that was a director's job. When Bernie Josephsberg appointed Stephanie as the assistant superintendent of curriculum, that was a change too, just as we're talking about here.
No, Marie was the assistant superintendent.
I don't believe that was accurate.
Oh, yes, that's true.
Be that as it may. I think to kind of bootstrap on Chris's comments a little bit, this calls me back to the meeting last month where we had a similar kind of debate about the process for negotiations on an annual basis. And one of the takeaways was that the negotiating committee should be charged with, among other things, coming up with a process that we can all agree to for a going forward basis. And I think that this is a similar situation where an agreed to process for however it is that central shared positions are going to be hired for. But I think that whatever that process ultimately is, if we're able to agree on one, I wouldn't accept a process that didn't include a mechanism for an exception. The same way when Scott comes to us and says, we need to do $15,000 of work on this well out here. You can go out and you can get 3 bids, but I'm gonna tell you right now, the only guy who knows how to do it is John. So let's just waive the 3-bid requirement and take John. I think here we have a situation where we can either accept the judgment of 2 out of the 3 boards that have already effectively made a decision about a person to fill this role, or we can kind of blow it all up at the expense of the decision that those 2 boards have already made, which I don't think is going to help really anybody, because ultimately, when we're creating a situation like this, we're not creating a position out of whole cloth so much as we're converting an existing position into a different position. And I think that if we were to turn a director of curriculum into an assistant superintendent of curriculum, there would be a default expectation as to how that would be done, which would not be post it and expose the director to losing his or her job. And I think this is much more analogous to that than it would be to other things. And so I think that if there were a process in place, there would be an exception. This would be a circumstance for the exception, because the way this is structured right now, it's highly unlikely we will ever hit a point in time where there are vacancies in both chairs. And so 4 years from now, it could be there's a vacancy in Easton Reading, but there's not at Region 9. Should we take the Region 9 director? And the viewpoint is going to be, well, we love the Region 9 director. You should just take them. But would we push back and say, well, no, we should post the job and expose the Region 9 director to losing his or her job? It's not an ideal situation for anybody, and I understand the feeling of being left out in the process. However, I think if there's a circumstance that calls for an exception, and this is the one, and it has the endorsement of the incumbent at Region 9, and it has the endorsement of your colleagues at both the Easton and Reading Board, I think that should carry significant weight.
Well done, Christopher.
Yeah, well, again, you make a valid point, but I don't think it's the only point. I think that, the reality is that this position can be added really at any time. Region 9 is going to have to backfill and hire someone to replace our director anyway. And there's no way that I can see that one person is going to be able to run your K-8, and run everything that Patty does here. So we have to backfill anyway. Where this becomes challenging is when a position is taken that it's we're only comfortable with this person, and so if there's any jeopardy in this new position, we're not interested because it's this person, or we're not interested. And that's where it becomes difficult, because certainly you can keep the director and we can keep our director, and then you can reapproach this at some point and do it, and again, we can say there is no defined process, and I think, my motion was more in alignment with previous searches of the board or best practices rather than past practices, but there should be a defined process, and there's no excuse that there isn't. And this position was discussed over a year, maybe a year and a half ago, about the possibility of this being created and about the need for a process and an inclusion of everybody in that process. And what happened was, it didn't happen. I understand you have a employee who you highly value and you want to step up to that position. I just think that it's unfair to expect us to be there at this point. And I also think that they're 2 very different positions. If you had interviewed for an assistant superintendent for pupil services, you probably would have had a bigger pool of applicants than you did for the...
Is that speculation, or is that based on any facts?
Well, again, just like when you say...
I would ask the superintendent to comment on the applicant pool for special services directors on a K-12 basis.
Well, districts use, the same work is done under 2 or 3 separate titles. There's directors of special ed, there are assistant superintendents of pupil personnel, there are assistant superintendents of special education. It's all the person in charge. The pool is very shallow because of the difficult nature of the work. and the fact that it appears in this region at least, and I think probably across the state, that that our experience of going through people in just a couple of years is not unusual. For the position of Reading Elementary School principal, I think we had more than 60 applications. For the position of director of special ed, we had less than 20, and a good 6 or 7 of those are people who have applied for every administrative opening we've had. So really it was about a dozen, 14 people. I don't have the actual number. But it is a limited pool. It's the toughest job in education. So.
Well, Mike is right that there's hypothetically somebody out there who is even better for this job. The reality is that there are many, many more people who are less qualified for the job. And if we say, let's cut bait on the person we have now and basically go out to bid and hope for the best, we're not just going out to bid in the shallow pool. We're going out to bid in the shallow pool, also competing with 5, 6, 8, 10 other districts who are also looking for the best person. And you're not going to convince me that coming to these meetings is as attractive as coming to other districts.
No, you're absolutely right, but the reality is that, you know, if that person came in and was highly successful, they may leave to go to a different district because of these meetings as well. So, I mean, there's really no guarantee with that.
I also was curious about whether an assistant superintendent central office job at a Durgay school district might, with a significantly higher salary, might draw a larger pool of candidates, and that we had a duty to ensure that we saw all of those candidates. This is a larger salary. It's a more prestigious job than a director, either high school level or pre-K-8 director. I feel like an assistant superintendent central office job is probably more prestigious than that, and I feel like we have an obligation to our students and the public. I've also been following this stuff for a long time, and I've watched public reaction to the central office budget over the years, and public reaction to the perception that I have already heard from the public is the creation of an expensive central office administrator while our enrollment is declining still. And I think that to not only, you know, when you have a chunk of the public that's skeptical of what they are going to label an expensive central office administrator, and then you create that position, not only create the position, but you don't post the job, you don't search for the right person. I'm saying she's not the right person. You don't search to make sure you have exhausted all possibilities. You're not helping yourself as far as gaining public support for this new position which we are creating, which I'm not opposed to. And finally, so those are some things that I think are legitimate, and it's not just me pushing back because I didn't get to be sitting in on the round table 18 months ago. I've sat in on a lot of superintendent community search interviews, and you know, they don't all come out the way you like, some do. And my third point would be that based on the numbers that were put out at the Reading meeting, I find that there's a kind of, I would call it a precipitous decline in PPDs and PPTs, and a precipitous increase in kids who are being exited from SPED, which would, to me, perhaps, I'd like to know more about that, because that is a little concerning. I don't know if I find that something to celebrate.
I'd like to ask, with respect, that if we're going to make comparisons in Durgay and say this is a prestigious Durgay opening, you'd have to also say that the salary range that you're paying your senior administrators here is actually Durgay. Each and every one of your senior administrators is the lowest paid in that reference group. So it's really AB. Not that it isn't a good salary, you know, just for context for that. I think where you are is that the proposal didn't carry. It had to be in all 3 districts in agreement. Region 9 has some valid concerns about process, so I'd say at this point that your action is simply to unwind it. The Easton and Reading Board is not willing to compromise the employment of their Director of Special Services. There's a virtue to having the right process. I find it sometimes fiendishly annoying, but it's also not a bad practice. I will say that I have been pushing and pushing you the whole 5 years that I've been in this role. Get your policy book up to date. We've tried multiple iterations of that. You're finally getting to that place. There are a lot of practices that we have that are living in the corporate memory of the people at the table. If you want to reduce everything to process, I'm fine with that, but it's not actually, there is not existent, this is the four-step process that we're going to always follow in this situation or something else. That's maybe work to be done. But why deliberate and perseverate on it when it seems fairly clear that the decision is, does Region 9 accede to the proposal? And the answer appears to be no, so I think just...
For the record, now that we've reviewed the process, no, I would support the overall process. To me, this is an opportunity. It's not it's imperfect. And to Chris Hocker's point, perhaps that's something we should revisit. To Chris Parkin's point, let's throw it in with, other things that we discussed at the last meeting. But I think there's an opportunity to try to regionalize what we can without being regional. And it's not going to be perfect, but we should take whatever opportunity we can. And I personally am comfortable with the process, and I'm relying on the judgment. This is a governance role. This is not a management role. So if the management and the other governing boards are telling us that they feel very confident in the role and the candidates being, I'm supportive of it. My only concern was the process and making sure that the public is aware that there is discretion permitted to any school district to hire its employees the way that it thinks is appropriate, provided it meets appropriate policies, which in this case it does. So just for the record, that's kind of where I am. And in a spirit to try to bridge the gap here, would anybody be open to an interim position?
They don't want to do that.
Define interim
Do you
position.
have thoughts about how that could work?
I'm just wondering if you guys would be open to an interview.
Well, there was an interview.
We did interview.
There was.
Oh, yeah?
The current person. We're saying
Just
we would
wanted
like
to see
to
other
post,
people.
get a job description
Right.
and interview,
Full process.
full process.
As opposed to just promoting from within, kind of.
So go ahead, Jen.
Thank you, Tom. Can we as Easton and Reading have a quick conversation about sort of what is the risk benefit here to us to sort of digging our heels in and saying no to this? And maybe Tom can weigh in on that. Like, are we concerned that we're going to lose Jen? Are we concerned that we're going to offend her and that she's not going to want to participate in the process? I don't know. If as described, the process is going to be open, it's going to bring more people in, there's a stakeholder group that is part of the conversation, but Tom is the one who's ultimately making the decision. I don't know, just
I don't
airing
put
it for...
I don't put a lot of weight in the idea that by changing it from a director to an assistant superintendent, we're suddenly going to broaden the pool to get all these wonderfully qualified candidates. I don't think they exist.
So then why would we refuse? Because we could end up with the best of both worlds if we say, okay, let's go ahead with this process.
If
To
the,
make
if the process is to conduct a search, then the current Director of Special Services will not be applying for the position and will just go out and get another job. I checked it, I believe there's 7 openings in the state of Connecticut, and there'll be more as the spring unwinds. I think that part of being highly competent is knowing your value, your market value. I worked for 10 years in another Durgay system in Ridgefield. Part of my context on this is the principal resigned. The assistant principal was called to the superintendent's office and came back, appointed the principal. There was no search. There was simply an appointment that took place at Ridgefield High School. I happen to know through conversation that Darienne's assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction has taken the job as the new superintendent in Ridgefield, and the superintendent in Darien intends to simply appoint an internal candidate for that. So each district goes about this in its one way. There's nothing wrong in laying out a process and understanding it with caveats. I think, what would an interim mean? It means that you would be extending this person's authority to K-12, pre-K-12. You'd be hiring a supervisor at the high school, and then if you didn't like it, I guess you'd be, I don't think an interim.
It seems like the only place the interim works is an interim supervisor at Barlow, because I don't think you're necessarily going to find a permanent incumbent with any sort of great haste. And if you went the interim route at Barlow for a year, then we could have this conversation next year about, you know what, we went out, we looked, we searched, you're right, there isn't anybody else, let's revisit this and let's move the director up to an assistant superintendent role.
But I also like to be clear, so you're saying even if we post this for 5-10 business days, we create a job description, which we haven't seen for this role yet, that the current person, which we have no objection to her as a person, will not apply for this job, is what you're saying? So we will lose this person from the other two boards because she will not apply for this higher paying, more prestigious job.
This person as a candidate has made a commitment to Easton and Reading and wants to continue in that commitment, does not wish to become one of many candidates for the position of assistant superintendent for pupil personnel. So that if there's a posting, then I do not think you would see an application for that. I think we would be doing this, the search without that person as a candidate in the mix, which I would not advise.
Because I don't think anybody here really objects to the person. We don't
No,
want
I
to
know
put
that.
the other
And
boards in a bad position if she is not going to move forward and you lose the person.
I think
Don't
that's the
necessarily want
issue.
to
I think
cause that problem.
the possible benefit of having the central office position is outweighed by the possible risk of losing who we have after, we've been through so many interims and seen the results of what, interims can give us. Just not willing to risk it. Doesn't outweigh the benefit.
I think
For us.
all
For
three,
me, sorry.
all three boards agree that having a pre-K-12 position is attractive and desirable. It's a question of how we get from, we have a permanent position and you don't, to we all agree on what the 4 permanent positions ultimately are. And there's never going to be an elegant solution to that, short of saying, let's throw the baby out with the bathwater and start all over again, which I don't think anybody's really comfortable with doing.
Do we agree on that? Because I heard from, I heard from you, Mike D'Agostino, is that you're not confident that one person can cover the umbrella. I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. Do we agree that the proposed structure of having one person in place, we're all behind? So let's
We already
remove the
passed that.
person,
We
the
voted at
actual
the last
person.
board meeting. We
We're
agreed
cool
to
with
the
the structure, we just don't think we have the right person? Is that?
No, that's not.
No,
We
it's
agreed to the
process.
structure at the last meeting, so we're on board with the structure. I think it's just, again, more the process if we post the job, interview candidates, or appoint, I think is, speaking for the board here. So that-
Right, I think that's
But I think structurally and compensation, right, we passed that all jointly last time.
in the, when we went through the candidates for the, because we were looking for a director and for supervisors, this past time, we had, there were 3 candidates that came. One that had experience, which was Jim. 2 who, this would be their first administrative opportunity. The year before that, the superintendent couldn't bring anyone to us because there were no candidates that he felt were even worth forming a committee to talk to. The year before that was the same thing, and the year before that was the same thing. So we've had 3 interims over the last 5 years until this year, when he was able to say, I have a candidate that I think you're going to like. We're going to show you 3 folks that we have a good feeling about, and it didn't take the committee long to figure out who the experienced person was and who were the 2 new ones. So we have a very good person who is very competent, is already being very proactive with the Bridges program, which she has brought forward for Easton. I think she's got the same. You guys are having the same kind of discussions. I know that program very well. It's outstanding. It's a way to stop outplacement in many cases, and so we've got a winner. And to suggest that there might be somebody else out there that's better, I think is all for the benefit of, well, we went through the process. Well, what if you don't get someone who is better? What if you end up having to settle for another interim, and you're back on the wheel?
But I think that we should probably call the question at this point, and to the extent that there's not a consensus as to what to do, figure out whether we're all going to adopt a revised central office budget here or do it individually over the next board cycle.
I think so, unless anyone, I thought I saw a couple of hands earlier, but no.
Yeah, I was just gonna comment that I try to weigh upsides versus downsides of any kind of tricky question like this. And what I'm hearing is that the idea of the position is okay with everybody, that the person is at least okay with everybody. And that comes down to a matter of process, which I think that's another point of agreement, is that we can all agree that the process that was followed was less than ideal, at least in somebody's opinion. And we may all have different ideas of what the process should be, but whatever it was, this probably wasn't it. Okay. So back to upsides and downsides. I'm thinking that the downside of reopening is worse than the upside of instituting a process first, and then hopefully we get somebody of equivalent or better credentials. It's just simply an analysis like you would with
From our standpoint,
anything
it
else.
seems like we've hit a triple, and we can have a redo and try to hit a home run.
Or we could strike out.
Or we can keep the, yeah, right.
You're right.
Or we
Or
stick with the triple.
And let her steal home all by herself.
There's certainly no harm with keeping it the way it is for now, and Region 9 can do a search and see and learn everything that you guys are saying, and maybe come back, tail between our legs next year and saying, gee, yeah, we want to do that. It's, I just think that there's merit to that as well.
Because you're going to need a position one way or the other. The question is what you're going out and looking for. Because if you go out and look for a director and you hire an interim director or a permanent director, it's rock hard place again as to having multiple directors where really you want 3 supervisors and a...
Right, but if the turnover and the quality is a challenge, we may end up back here again, if everybody's right? So, I mean, it's...
Again, I think you called the question, Chris?
So, I don't know if we need to summarize the motion. The motion is to post the job, go through the process. On Reading, all in favor of the motion? All opposed? It's unanimously opposed.
Same question for Easton.
Question.
All in favor of the proposal? All opposed?
To Region 9, sorry. Region 9, the same. In favor of posting and interviewing for it, and for not doing so. All right. So, does not, the motion here passes for us to do a search and post. So, at this point, we don't agree to the structure, and we probably need to...
But you agree to the structure, you don't agree to the process.
The process, so, yes, so...
Which begs sort of the ancillary question of, if we've created a
structure
position
that we,
that lives, we either need to undo that position, or we need to leave the position vacant for an indefinite period of time. Because we've said we want the position. Do we want to say we're undoing the position, or are we leaving it hanging out there? Because,
Well, if you leave it hanging out, there was a dollar amount attached to it, so
Well-
you'd have to withdraw.
well, we passed a motion to create the position, then we passed a budget. So we
With
can.
the dollar amount.
Right, so the question is, do we revise the budget tonight, or do we say, let's go back and take the money out in our next board cycle as we need to?
Yeah, that's a question you, I'm just saying the position has to be taken out, or else it's in the budget and it's part of the budget.
Heather?
so-
I think we have to take it out.
If we undo the position, remove that, undo that budget, we would I think we'd have a better chance of keeping the person who's in the position that we have now, that these two boards would like to keep,
Right,
rather than creating this position
that sits vacant,
that
basically.
sits vacant and saying, it's gonna be vacant, but you can't have it. Right.
I mean, it sounds like we're at a point where we need to unwind that, let Region 9 figure out what it wants to do, and if next January it's tail between the legs time, we revisit the question, basically.
Okay, so
so we go to each of the boards and undo the structural position and for the
So
assistant
is there a motion from Reading to eliminate the position of Assistant Superintendent for Pupil Services?
And revert to the previous arrangement.
And revert to the previous arrangement. Mike? Heather, second.
Is there any other budget impact to central office?
No, it's the only thing that we added to central
So
office
it's
was the
simply a matter
salary.
of taking out
Right.
that.
Right,
Reallocating that chunk
right.
two ways.
Right, to you and us.
Okay, Easton, same
Same motion.
motion? You need a second? Okay, any further discussion? Okay, all in favor?
You want to go, I was taking motions all the way around, but
Yeah.
we didn't vote yet.
We'll go.
Oh, okay.
It needs to
All right.
unwind too.
Discussion.
I love the voting part.
No, I guess it's the same motion, but to go back, obviously we need to withdraw support for the position, but to revert back to, I don't know that we did anything structurally that changes, but
Right.
it's the same, essentially the same.
same motion. Yep. Second, then someone.
Mike and Mary Lee, is that what
Yes,
it
Mike and
was
Mary Lee,
first?
All right,
Further discussion? Anybody? All right. All in favor for Reading?
Easton, any other thoughts? All in favor? Okay, we're done.
we do not.
That's an hour of my life I'll never get back.
That one was unanimous.
Now, just so I want to be clear, has your motion encompassed there's $180,000 in the central office budget? Did your motion just remove that amount, divided by thirds, so each of the budgets would have a reduction of $60,000, and then the Easton and Reading budgets would have the restoration of the original 50-50 split of the salary?
That was exactly the motion.
That's a part of the, that's a part of reverting.
No, what did
Can we amend the motion? Can we say
60,000, right?
Yes.
financial implications?
Right, 60 out of,
Right, we bear half and half instead of a third, and right, you've got to fix your budget.
We'll have to do that again and,
Correct.
Mark, we don't,
Do we have to
agreement, we
repass
don't need a motion, which is our next item for the central office budget, so we don't need a
I would
motion.
think we would.
Yeah.
Right. Are we passing a revised central office number? We probably, either we need to do it together, or we need to do it separately, but one way that has to get done.
What's on the agenda?
Yeah, central office budget.
We do need a motion on central office budget. Okay, so everybody's,
Anybody have the number?
Scott would like a motion on the central office budget, so let's go ahead and do that, because that's the next item.
Scott, do you have a number?
I do have the number.
What's the number?
So can you provide
The
us the number?
budget, the central office budget that was passed in the last tri-board meeting on January 21 was $2,093,915. If we remove $180,000 from that, the revised central office budget would be $1,913,915. 1913915.
Is there a motion from Reading to approve a central office budget in the amount of $1,913,915? Mike, second. John?
Easton, Same question?
Second?
Second?
Second.
And Region 9, same?
It was Randy and John Denham.
Thanks.
Motion second for the central office. All right, so motion was, I'm sorry. Mary Lee and Glenn.
Don't be shy.
There's Mary Lee and me.
Thank you.
And we need to vote on it.
Discussion?
Yep.
Discussion, vote.
Reading, all in favor?
All in favor?
Aye. All in favor? All right. So the budget has been set for central office. It's also item D, any discussion, possible action. To move forward, public comment. None, all right, board member.
Did you even,
Sorry,
Even ask?
did you even ask public?
public comment. All right. Board member comment, and then Tom, I think you would like to make a comment.
Listen, I've been with you now for 13 years, 16 years actually, but 13 as an administrator. And when I came here those 13 years ago, just take a moment, where were you as 3 separate districts? You had 3 separate data management systems. You had one version of SASE in Easton, another version of SASE in Reading, and you had Max School in Region 9. You now have a unified student data management system. Before Dr. Pearson-Ugal took over the current role 8 years ago, you had 3 separate curricula that were neither vertically nor horizontally aligned. You used different textbooks at the elementary schools for the same subject areas. You had professional development on different days that were not coordinated. Now you have unified curricula in the K-8 system that's vertically aligned with the high school. Now you have your professional development lined up. You are, you're bringing the same conversations to the same group of people. You had a whole bunch of ways that central office was absolutely carved into thirds, and now you have a greater effort on our part to make it unified. Or as I've said to you for 5 years, you're trying to be one unified pre-K-12 school system in 3 separate districts, and that is daunting just to say. So I want us not to go, oh, gee, this is another cock-up. It's not. It's just another attempt that maybe the time wasn't right for you to make another step towards being a unified system with 3 separate and distinct governing agencies and budgets and so forth. The work you're doing now to unify your policy is right on. And it's moving on. It takes a lot of time and effort on the part of the members there, but that's just another step forward. So look at this as another step in your process. And thank you. It is difficult to convince people who have choices that they can work in K-12 unified systems that it's worth coming here. And it is worth coming here. This is a great place to work for you folks. But one of the things that I really want us to take away is once we hire you, we don't a year later unhire you. And that's what you've accomplished, and I have no problem with make your process tighter and better. But I do think that this weighing of the optics of central office versus everything else, your central office is still very small and very tight and doing everything in triplicate. So you're not going to get the pristine version of everything. Sometimes you're just going to make do. But we are continuing the process of unifying the experience from the student's perspective. Thank you.
Any other board member comment? I would just like to thank the other boards for coming and participating on, not too short of notice, but I know we've tried to schedule this at the time, so thank you for coming and discussing the matter with us. And at that, we'll adjourn the meeting.
Motion to adjourn, John, second, Mike, all in favor? Aye. Reading is adjourned at 7:53.
Motion to adjourn? Second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Region 9,
7:53.
Move to adjourn.
Gwen, Gwen, all in favor? Aye, we're adjourned, 7:53. Thank you all for attending Region 9. You now have your regular board meeting. Thank you, so we'll get a 5-minute break to